Legislature's back in order. Senator Again, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your patience, and to our colleagues. And just to let the public know, the delay in the start of the session is primarily because we were working with legal counsel to come up with an appropriate language to address the application and the use of the bond proceeds. Mr. Speaker, based on that note, if I can move or request that rescind the amendment that I have proffered as of yesterday, and I would like to propose another one, please.
On the motion to withdraw, hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's a amendment that was circulated just a minute ago by our clerk personnel, and it would add on line 9, page 37, to amend subsection 10220 and to add a new paragraph to subsection 10220 to read, "The authority is prohibited from using bond proceeds for any purpose not provided for in this section without legislative approval in the form of duly enacted legislation." So, Mr. Speaker, I ask our colleagues for your consideration and your support of this amendment. Thank you very much.
On the new Uggan amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to speak on the new Uggan amendment? Senator Nicholas.
If I may just have a few minutes, Mr. Speaker, to review the amendment in the context of where it's being placed in the bill.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the Uggan amendment while Senator Nicholas reviews? Any objection? Any objection to the Uggan amendment? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair. I too am trying to see how it fits in to the section that it's purported to put under. I guess the one thing that I have to at least take a look at is subsection I of section 10220, and it has "for any other purpose authorized by law." And again, I'm not really sure the breadth of what existing law authorizes for the use of bond proceeds or any monies. And so to add this amendment in, I'm not really sure if it would be contrary to subsection 10220I.
Senator, would you wish to address that, or would GITA representative wish to address that as to how that might be?
So with 10220I, again, for any other purpose authorized by law, and you want to,
well, you know, and relative to the amendment that's before us,
right.
It basically reads, "The authority is prohibited from using bond proceeds for any purpose not provided for in this section without legislative approval in the form of duly enacted legislation." And so when you place that against that subsection I, which says the bond proceeds can be used for any purpose authorized by law. I'm just not clear, because I don't know all the purposes authorized by law, whether they actually conflict.
Okay. And so the way 10220 is written, payments made, which may be made out of the law? So,
Yeah, point of information, Mr. Chairman. Actually, it was just pointed out to me that that subsection I in this amendment is now deleted, and well, will be deleted. And so the new language, I suppose, under subsection I would be the language contained in this amendment. So I now just pull back my concern. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and so we should make it clear, because they struck out I, and this would be a new I, replacement I. All right, fine. Any other, Senator Torres?
I noticed that compared to the prior amendment, which was withdrawn, we are now amending page 37 as opposed to page 47, which was a line item appropriation of the funds. Is page 37 in fact the more operative place to put this amendment? Because we were looking yesterday, and where the contention was in the actual itemization on page 47, which was section 3. And we were limiting the appropriation, the line item appropriations, putting that limitation on it at that time. But now we're actually moving it to another section, which is the section that just deals with the payments in general to be made out of the proceeds. So I'm just noting that we're going more from a point of being specific to a point of policy. Is that the correct and more appropriate place for it?
I will take a short recess and have legal explain it to the body. Thank you. We're back on. Are you satisfied, Senator Torres? Has that been explained by legal?
I am satisfied.
And I understand that this amendment is going to Senator Snickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the interest of just having redundancy, the original amendment to place it on page 37, line 9 is fine, but I would also like to extend the exact same language onto page 47, line 10 as a motion.
On the motion to place the amendment proffered by Senator Uggan on both page 37 and 47, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard on the proposal to place the proffered amendment in two sections, section I on 37 and at the end of page 47. Any objection? Any objection? Senator Uggan, anything further?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, one of the things I want to emphasize before I propose the other amendment, because there were some questions raised by yourself as well as other members of this body with regards to the amount that's being borrowed, the capitalized interest, as well as the debt reserve, annualized debt reserve requirement. But you know, Mr. Speaker, when we take a look at this legislation and just highlighting the amendment that was just passed, it's ensuring that based on the authorization provided here, that we recognize that these bond proceeds will be applied in the areas that is highlighted in the legislation for critical capital improvement projects. That's the first and foremost aspect in terms of being able to support the Port Authority in any bond issuance. It's got to be applied not towards operational requirements, but specifically for upgrade or repair or replacement of infrastructure as well as facilities. And just in line with that, there was a discussion, or there were discussions yesterday about the interest rate, whether 6.5 would be appropriate in this particular case, considering that is the Port Authority of Guam's first bond issuance that they're going to pursue should this legislation pass. And based on that, I'd like to once again ask the GITA representative, Ms. Garcia, if she can highlight really the environment of the financial markets out there and how they could conceivably look at the Port Authority of Guam with its initial issuance going into the bond market. So, Ms. Garcia, Mr. Chairman, if I can ask you to please allow her to respond.
Thank you, Senators, and good morning. What has changed in the past month is we have started viewing versions of both the Senate and the House of Representatives tax reform proposals. And in both versions, and we don't know which one will pass, it's going to impact the tax exemption of bond borrowing by governments for activities that are considered private use. And this primarily affects ports and airports in that they're providing the service and facilities and leasing space out to clients or tenants to help and assist in providing that service. And, you know, they're still in review, and what we do know is they are considering that financing of this private use bonds may no longer be tax exempt. And so, meaning the interest rate on that portion of the debt may be higher than if it were tax exempt. And they're looking at, again, we've heard the news that they're hoping to pass this legislation or this tax reform by the end of the year, and being that we're hoping to close the port financing first quarter, we're we feel that if they pass this removal of the tax exempt on private type uses, then we will need to, again, request that the interest rate be maintained at 7%, because we feel that that will give us the ability to provide the best financing for the port.
But based on your overall presentation with regards to the port's finances, you're still going to pursue the best interest rate possible for the port and on behalf of the people of Guam?
Yes, sir, definitely. We do work with the underwriters. With the last Guam Waterworks bond, with our presentations, we oversubscribed those bonds by 10 times. But again, those were all tax-exempt bonds. We hope to maintain that type of interest in our bonds. But again, a new port financing, we don't know what the results will be.
Just so that perhaps my colleagues and I, just so that I have a better understanding also of the difference between a revenue bond versus a general obligation bond, can you just provide clarity as it applies to the proposed legislation?
Sure. The difference is that general obligation type bonds are secured by tax revenues of the government of Guam. And so, so that's not based on fees. It's set on a specific tax collection and coverage. When you're talking revenue bonds, those revenues are secured by historical collections of that activity. So be it power and water, they're not tax revenues. Everybody, I mean, the collection is based on what the tariffs or the rates are being charged on their collection history and so on. So those are considered the revenues. The bondholders will secure their investment with the revenues of that agency. So again, that's the primary difference between the two. One is secured by tax collection. The other is the revenues of the entity. And again, when we go out for these revenue bonds, they review the whole process of how rates are set, how does it compare competitively. They do ask the question on how has the increases been, how have increases in rates been treated and so on. So again, they look at different sets of data for revenue type bonds.
So the adoption, should this legislation be adopted and the Port Authority be authorized to go out into the bond market to borrow money, then the source of repayment would be the revenues originating from the operations of the Port Authority of Guam and not the general tax dollars.
Yes.
So it's
Solely
viewed
the
also as a
revenues.
private activity bond? Is that?
Well, again, for port, because part of that is going to finance facilities that will be leased out, that is considered private use, private activities.
Also, one of the questions that was asked previously, sometime yesterday, was in regards to the interest rate. You highlighted the request that the interest rate be reconsidered and returned back to the 7% to allow yourself and the Port Authority of Guam to be able to try to acquire the best rates and as much flexibility as possible. Now, with regards to the interest, the capitalized interest requirement, can you just highlight what your approximate amount would be, and then also your annualized debt service requirement? Because I know that those are two other components outside of the request to borrow $45+ million for capital improvement projects and the remaining balance for refinancing existing debt, that you're asking for the annualized debt service to be included in this bond issuance as well as capitalized interest.
So what we've been reviewing with the port for the project fund size of a $65 million project, we are looking at debt and estimated average annual debt service of anywhere from $4.5 million, which is for 30 years, upwards to 5.1 mil. And that's for 25-year debt. And again, these are investment grade ratings. We also looked at non-investment grade just because, you know, it's part of our due diligence, and that 30-year debt for non-investment grade would run you at $4.75 million to as high as $6 million for the 25-year debt on a $65 million project. So depending on what the policy is, capitalized interest is normally set at an annual debt service payment. And then when you look at the other fund deposits, of course you're going to make your deposit into, with the bond proceeds, we list it down. There are other things that have to be covered, such as the required reserves. And again, that's to cover 1 year's debt service. Should the, you know, again, just added security for the financing. We can go without it, but again, that could impact our interest rates. And that amount will normally be used to pay off last year's debt service. And the other thing would be deposits into our cost of issuance. Again, these are scrutinized costs that have to be tied directly with the financing, to include any trustee fees, underwriters' fees, and so on. And normally we ask that as a placeholder, it's 2% of the par, but on an average, we've come in at maybe 1.6% of par on our financing. So again, it really depends on how much work is going into it. And again, we think we can still work with a 2% cost of issuance just because you know, again, it's a new credit. So those are the primary deposits that we would have to fund.
So once again, if you can just highlight those numbers, the capitalized interest amount could conceivably be what amount, and then the annualized debt service?
So the capitalized interest, again, 1 year CAPI would be anywhere from 4.5 to as high as 6 mil, depending on investment, non-investment grade. And then the balance, and again, we are running our scenarios. Our balance would run, again, if we had 65 million fund, anywhere from a 65 for 15 mil, anywhere from a 10 mil to cover the other costs to 9 to 10 mil to cover the other costs, other deposits, be it your reserves and your cost of issuance. And again, with these are just placeholders. We normally strive to do a lot better than what you give to us.
So your capitalized interest amount could be anywhere from $4.5 million to 6 mil, and then your balance reserves plus additional costs would be anywhere from $9 to $10 million.
Yes.
As placeholders.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you very much for allowing Gita to provide that representation and that information. I do have an amendment that would set aside a specific amount for up to an amount not to exceed $4 million to fund the capitalized interest, and then up to an amount not to exceed $11 million for the debt reserve requirement by virtue of issuing this particular bond. So, Mr. Speaker, and also in conjunction with that, the adjustment back upwards of the 6.5% to 7%. And I understand that according to the clerk's representative that the amendment was circulated. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to proffer that amendment at this point in time, please.
All right. Before we start discussing the amendment, I think Senator Nicholas had some follow-up questions to your questions to Gita. So, Senator Nicholas.
Mr. Speaker, just point of order. We did not receive the amendment that just so you...
We're not on the amendment right now. There was just questioning that was being posed to the members, and preliminarily, and I believe Senator Nicholas, at least from the flailing of his arms, had some questions as to the answers that were given. So I'll give him a chance to ask those questions first. Then we will go back to the amendment and we'll deal with the amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
But
Speaker.
this is a committee of the whole, so it's pretty loose to be able to ask questions. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the questions from the author, and I appreciate the answers from Gita. You know, in light of the information that's being shared throughout the course of this committee of the whole, I wanted to kind of connect some pieces so I can fully understand what we're looking at right now. So based on what you just shared, Ms. Garcia, we're not going to be able to have triple tax exempt status on these bonds because they are going to be private activity bonds if the tax reforms kick in and they disallow those types of bonds to be triple tax exempt. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in your statement earlier, you mentioned that the component that was making this a private activity bond was the construction of vendor space that was going to be leased out. That was what was making this a private activity bond?
So private activity use, the portion of the bond that will be taxable will be determined by the legal counsels, and they will determine the amount of space that's going to be used by or leased by private companies to assist the port in providing the service.
But my concern is, will the entire bond issuance lose its triple tax exempt status because of the component that's being leased out to vendors, or is that going to be a separate series in a series of multiple bonds?
You're correct. We will run two series of bonds, of which one will be taxable, one will be non-taxable.
So if we're going to be setting an interest rate cap, perhaps we should set a larger cap on the private activity portion of the series and a lower cap on what should be the triple tax exempt portion of the series.
So when we, you could do that, yes. When we provide you a final analysis, we blend the two together to make sure that we're under the one cap. So just with the airport, we have like 2 or 3 series.
Right.
And what we do is they each have their individual rates, but the blended rate is where we anticipate that we will be able to bring it to below the max rate of 7%.
My other question was, so based on what's being proposed in the financing, we basically concluded that the administration building vendor portion is not going to be eligible for the triple tax exempt status. Is there anything else that would be considered private activity, or is it just that one piece?
Point of information, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I really appreciate this line of questioning and that our colleague is going down, because I had similar concerns. However, right now, the reason why we're hearing this bill at this junction is to try to go to the market before any legislation is passed, and because that would then negate any conversation of whether this borrowing would be available for the tax exemption. So if we're going to take a look at trying to separate what might be viewed as private activity bonds so that the rest of the borrowing does qualify for the tax exemptions, it's too early. Because the reason why we're here right now listening to this bill and trying to get to market is to try to beat the vote in Congress, right, that would change the law on bond borrowing. So, and again, it's just a point of information that if we go to market now, that we still qualify, even if it is considered a private activity bond, it would still qualify right now as a tax-exempt bond.
That was the intent of the committee when we tried to schedule the hearing the 1st of September. But unfortunately, due to whatever happened and its delay, I was not the one. I believe it was Gita that said it would complete this in the first quarter. That was not my statement, okay? No. And so his question is proper because they're the ones that said first quarter of the new year. So I'm just...
Okay, no, and...
So I'm just so that we understand. Yes, and that's the reason why we allowed this to be at the top of the calendar.
Right.
In the hopes of trying to pass it, I thought, last night. And so they could try to go out, but right. let's just get the questions out, and then let's see if we can get it voted on today as opposed to next week.
Thank you.
My question, Mr. Chairman, was whether or not there was any other components in the financing aside from the vendor spacing that was also considered private activity use.
Senator, I wish I could tell you that, but there are tax consultants that get involved, and they're the ones that determine, for instance, how much of this is taxable and tax exempt. So, you know, I can't, you know, what percentage. And again, our goal is to get as much tax exempt of much of the projects qualified as tax exempt, and they're the ones that would highlight for us these are definitely taxable, and so I can't give you an answer today on this.
And so, Mr. Chairman, you know, in light of these questions, there's several things that really jump out at me. One is we're financing certain projects that have a useful life that's lower than the duration of the debt. We're financing projects and we're blending into a series of bonds, some that are going to be triple tax exempt and others that are not. And all of these things are being done in the consideration of a single tariff determination that was done by the port. And that for me, there's just a lot of moving parts with respect to this financing. I would suggest that we go back to the table and get a very, very clear picture as to what is going to be private activity and give that a higher debt service percentage, what is triple tax exempt, and give that a specific debt service percentage, and then reconsider whether we're still going to finance those projects that have a useful life that's lower than the duration of the actual debt overall. Absent that, you know, I really don't like going out for a 30-year bond for $65 million under the gun. If we can instead come back to the table and get a very clear structuring of the financing, then we'll be able to know exactly what the cost is. I'm still concerned about the idea of using capitalized interest if we're going to be already having the cash available because the tariff increase is already in effect. There's just a lot of elements to this financing that I'm very uncomfortable with. So aside from my motion that I've deferred with respect to Section 1, I'll also make a motion and defer it pending additional conversation to return the bill back to committee in order for us to get a very clear picture as to what this financing is going to be funding under what terms, and for us to structure that properly into the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I think that when we take a look at this legislation and the timing, we are trying to ensure that, in fact, the government of Guam can take advantage of any tax-exempt bonds that could be floated within a reasonable time frame before Congress acts. So the question now, are we going to forego any possibility of a tax-exempt bond issuance to take care of critical infrastructure of the Port Authority of Guam? Understanding the concern of our colleague, Mr. Speaker, I think the response was very appropriate by the GITA representative. At this time, she's not able to provide specifics until such time that she confides in the market experts or the tax experts that she has to confide in upon the approval of any bond issuance.
And he has not made the motion to send it back. Please make your motion, your proposal for an amendment, and let's continue to move on. I'm willing to plod forward.
Mr. Chair, before you plod on with the amendment, along the same line, if I may just ask a question because of the issues raised by the representative from GITA. And it was basically in line with what she presented yesterday and what she presented this morning, that in essence, we are taking a look at this bond as a private activity bond, right? And that's the reason for trying to rush this before Congress takes any action. Is that fair?
We're trying to go to the market as soon as we can, yes.
And if this passes, how soon do you anticipate going to market?
Right now, our timeline is 120 days, but there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of people fighting to keep the tax exemption status of these financings.
My understanding, Ms. Garcia, is that private activity bond really is financing for projects of a private user. This, I don't think, I mean, and I'm sure you probably, and I'm going to ask you, is that, since you're addressing this as a private activity bond, is that based upon any kind of determination by the expert that this is really a private activity bond? Because my understanding is, first of all, it's a revenue bond.
Right.
Right. And now you're saying it's also a private activity bond.
Right.
But my understanding of a private activity bond is that normally either the private company or the government will go to the bond market and for projects of a private user.
Right.
Right. I'm not sure this is a project for private users.
If I can, and the words are very, very closely related, but basically we are requesting for a revenue bond, a bond issuance by the government, by the Port Authority to improve their facilities. Some of these facilities are being, quote, going to be used to lease out to private companies, non-government entities. Again, they're providing they're helping in providing that service. And we're calling it private activity, but we're not saying a private activity bond. A private activity bond is a whole separate bond financing in which a private company borrows money on the bond market to help the government of Guam or help a government or municipality provide a service. And those are things like if we wanted to privatize, one of the things that is mentioned is if we wanted to privatize our transportation system completely, then they would build a railway, run it and everything, because they're providing a public service that wouldn't otherwise be provided by the government. That's called a private activity bond.
Right.
But the same, what we found though is that that whole use of tax-exempt funds for private companies is on the table for consideration, be it issued by a private company or issued by a government. And so that's what we're trying to start our process, get out in the market, get it done now, and hopefully we can stay ahead of the game and get again the best deal for the port at this time. Again, there are private activity bonds issued by private companies, and then we're issuing revenue bonds that will have a private company assisting in providing that service. So those types of bonds are specific to like airport and ports, where part of theirs are taxable debt and part of it is non-taxable debt or tax-exempt debt. So that's when we say private activity, in this instance, we're talking about the use of the funds, and we're not talking about private activity bonds where companies are borrowing money. So but both, again, what Congress and this House are considering is tax exemption removal for both types. So that's what we're trying to move quickly on.
Okay. All right. And it just caused a little bit of a flag that go up yesterday when you were talking about it specifically, because I know that this is not really, when you look at the definition and the industry standard of understanding what a private activity bond is, this is not a private activity bond per se. This is a revenue bond to construct and build out the port, right, and buy some equipment and things like that, right? And really, the very small portion, right now I believe it's 30% of the administration building is being utilized by private companies, And as we expand, the anticipation is 40% of usable space will be made available. But again, in total, it's not so much a private activity bond because this is really also a refinance of loans that are out there.
Correct.
But it's still basically a revenue bond.
That's correct.
Now, can I just ask, are revenue bonds affected by the proposed tax reform that is going forward?
Any, again, private use or any private use type bonds, meaning ports and airport bonds, will no longer be able to offer this tax exemption.
Okay, so it is necessary that we really try to look at this measure and try to get it through if we can, as soon as possible.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to clarify.
Thank you.
Senator Agan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Ms. Garcia, for highlighting some of the issues as it affects the market, because we definitely need to understand that. And I just need to remind ourselves, Mr. Speaker, and members of this body, that we have been discussing this measure since February, when initially the port had highlighted that they wanted to go out and borrow money. The committee had an informational hearing subsequent to that initial pronouncement, and then you also had a public hearing. So it's been under public review and discussion over the course of the past several months. So it's not like all of a sudden we're entertaining it here at the legislature. Mr. Speaker, I do have an amendment based on some of the information that was provided by Ms. Garcia in terms of funding the capitalized interest requirement, and then also the debt service reserve fund. And she also mentioned that readjusting the figure from 6.5% to a cap of 7% is the request that's being put forward by not only Ms. Garcia, but also the Port Authority of Guam. So, Mr. Speaker, I do have an amendment that entails those particular issues that were discussed yesterday and also during the course of our discussion in the last couple hours. And I would like to ask our colleagues for your consideration in approving this to allow the Port Authority of Guam to go out and acquire the funding that is necessary to address the projects highlighted in this legislation, to refinance some of their outstanding loans, and be able to simultaneously ensure that they meet the bond issuance requirements of the capitalized interest as well as the debt service reserve. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to proffer this amendment, and I request our colleagues' consideration.
We have the amendment before us, and I appreciate the fact that you're trying to put things together, but I have a feeling that you're going to complicate things by doing it in one piece. And so I really do think that you'd be better off if you had these in separate amendments so that we didn't get bogged down with this whole piece as opposed to smaller chunks that are digestible.
And what is your recommendation, Mr. Speaker? If you want to bifurcate it so that we address the
at least divide it into 3 or 4, but do things. We'll do things in seriatim on this, but not the whole amendment at one time, if that would be agreeable.
But, Mr. Speaker, during the course of the discussion, if some of our colleagues would like to make amendments to the proposed amendment, and certainly that's the prerogative. And that's one of the reasons why, based on the conversation yesterday, based on your suggestion that a figure be affiliated with a capitalized interest requirement rather than just leaving it open, and that the debt service also have a figure associated with that, that's why this amendment is being proffered. But, Mr. Speaker, if you would like to bifurcate it, that's your call.
I'm only sitting in as a chair for temporarily while this is your amendment, and so you can speak on it. Do you want to add anything else on this? Because I see 2 hands on this side have gone up. We'll start with Senator Nicholas, then Senator Nelson. On this side, who wants to be heard on this? Currently, the proposal is this whole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I believe we discussed this yesterday, and the Committee on Budget and Appropriation has the authority and also the tools necessary to adjust the bill. And it was communicated yesterday that there were changes made. So these changes that were in the bill that were made, which was 6.5% per annum, and then also the principal amount not to exceed 70 million. We're going back to the original bill. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd have to object this amendment. I support the changes that were made by the Committee on Appropriations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is basically a question back to Gita. And if you could just reiterate why a 7% would be more attractive than a 6.5%?
So again, we're going out to the market with a brand new credit. We're hoping we can get a investment grade. Everything we see as far as comparing to the criteria is an investment grade credit, but we never know what the analysts will think. And again, you know, we, just like we had with Guam Waterworks, we had a lot of questions that came out as a result of people that had, are still trying to recover from our other territorial brothers and sisters. So we want to provide that ability to be able to move quickly on this. Again, we believe that 7% will allow us to issue debt, whether it's investment grade or non-investment grade, and whether it's a 25-year debt or 30-year debt. Again, those are things that we want to get started on the analysis once we get the policy call from the legislature. And that's why we were saying that with the 7%, we will be able to work with that. We feel that we will be able to bring in under that, but we don't want to say if it's 6.8, then we won't be able to consummate the deal with the bondholders. So again, we are optimistic, but we still want to be able to move forward with the port. Again, when you have, we create the interest, generate the interest, get more investors involved, we're able to bring down the interest rate. But again, if you start off with too much constraint on our financing, then that may have people walk away by looking at the picture and not even wanting to participate because of the constraints. So we feel that if we say, you know, yes, we're maxed at 7, but based on the interest investment, we can actually bring it down. You're talking, you know, what could be investment grade or non-investment grade, and up to 30 years. So that's why we're asking for your indulgence to give us this. And again, we believe we can come under, but those are our overall constraints for this type of financing.
When was the last time that we've gone to market for any of our agencies or instrumentalities at 7%?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
When was the last time we went to market with a 7% cap? I know, you know, if I'm not mistaken, over the past few years, we have gone with a much lower figure than 7%. And I guess what I'm taking away from what you just said is because this is the first time that the port has gone to the bond market, that would, because they're newcomers to the market, I should say, that might draw some kind of hesitation. Is that?
That's correct. And normally with general obligations, our cap is at 6%. We're asking here for 7% for this revenue type debt, and I'm going to have to go back and look at what the law was for GWA and GPA. But again, those are already proven credits, as well as airport. They've been in the market, so we want to again address those investors that have said, yes, we like your other partners, but you know, you're new to us. So you know, there may, you know, we want to be able to address those issues as well.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Espaldon. Senators, the Speaker has asked once again and suggested that, in fact, we bifurcate all the individual items. So the first item that's being discussed right now is the capitalized interest in the amount not to exceed $4 million on that particular amendment. Any further discussion? Senator St. Nicholas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that particular amendment, I'd first like to register my objection. And the reason why, Mr. Chairman, is because let me re-explain capitalized interest all over again in case we forgot. Capitalized interest is basically adding money to what you're borrowing in order to cover your initial payments. And so it's like taking out a mortgage on your house, but taking out an extra $12,000 to cover the first year's payments for your mortgage. Now, one of the arguments that's been used regularly by those agencies that have employed capitalized interest is by doing that, they can smooth out the rate increases. They don't need to raise rates right away to pay for the debt because the capitalized interest is going to pay for it up front. And the argument is that by doing that, by not raising the rates and by using the capitalized interest to pay for it up front, we're therefore able to not make the ratepayers pay for a facility or what have you that's in the construction phase. You do that to prevent rates from going up, but the rates have already gone up. So if the rates have already gone up, why are you going to borrow for your initial payments if you already have the cash flow to pay for it? This capitalized interest isn't free money. We're going to pay fees on that. We're going to pay interest on that for 25 or 30 years. We don't need the capitalized interest because the rates have already gone up. Unless we're going to add into the bill a rate holiday for the next 12 months upon receipt of the capitalized interest. But we're making the consumers pay twice for the same amount of money by having capitalized interest. We should not have this. It adds costs. It's unnecessary because the rates have already gone up to pay for the debt service up front. So I object to this section 1 of this amendment.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. Colleagues, any other discussion on this amendment to insert in an amount not to exceed $4 million for funding capitalized interest? Senator?
Mr. Chair, if we could just hear for the record one more time from Gita the necessity of the capitalized interest. My apologies, not Gita, the port.
Or port. Well, again, the reason why this amount is here, and from what I understand from the port, is in their financial presentation to the PUC and in getting their tariffs by setting this cap at $4 million. In the capitalized interest account, although they're collecting the tariffs, they're still building up, and so without the rate shock, that's where the $4 million came from in funding capitalized interest in this amount. And again, it is, like the senator said, to level out tariffs and so on. But from what I understand, the $4 million is what was presented to the PUC in order to get the tariffs started. So again, perhaps, they're funding their to cover the rest of the debt service, but $4 million is what we needed to start on the cap-I for the port in their PUC filings.
So just to reiterate, so the PUC went ahead and allowed for the rate increase in good faith with an expectation of the cap-I before it was even came into existence. So was the rate increase on the tariff based off the presumption that this would be approved?
Just a reminder, Mr. Chairman, everyone's under oath. We have not seen this cap-I number until today.
No,
So
we
I don't
understand.
think anyone
Senator
can testify to
Sinclair,
that.
We understand. Everyone was swore under oath. Mr. Duenas or Senator Brown? Any response to the question?
Yes, that proposal was submitted to PUC when we petitioned them the first time around. That was about a year ago when we submitted the request for a tariff increase, and that included capitalized interest. Now, the capitalized interest is not accumulated in the first month or the first year. The tariff prorates it for up to 2 years, 3 years to get that money up to that level. It's pretty much a collect and pay as you go on a monthly basis for the tariff for Cap I and for the debt service reserve. So the 7% is it covers a lot of factors for port operations, not just for bond payment.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
I'm
Duane.
just a bit curious because it just seems, and I could be incorrect here, but it just seemed irregular that the PUC would approve a rate increase based on something that really didn't exist. There was no Cap I, there was no $4 million. None of this was in existence because it had not been passed by this body. And so I'm just a little taken aback that the PUC approved the tariff increases based on a presumption that, you know, their possibility may never come. And that's just something that caught me off guard, and I just wanted to address that.
PUC has the regulatory oversight of Port Authority.
I understand.
So when we submitted our tariff request, part of the tariff request was the use of funds and the cost of services, and those were submitted in the petition.
I understand,
and their consultants looked over.
But you got to understand my position, Mr. Dueñas, is the information you presented to the PUC to justify your tariff increase was based on a presumption that the legislature would approve the Cap I based on your presentation to them, which was not the case. It was a bit presumptuous, and that's my issue, is did the PUC have all of the information? And again, I'm just trying to, obviously we don't want to put the cart before the bull, and I'm sure everyone has the best interest of the people in the port in mind, but that was I think a bit presumptuous for that to have gone on by the PUC.
Senator, I just want to elaborate further because I don't think it's a question that PUC assumed the legislature was going to approve a bond. I think it was the hope that if the legislature were to entertain a bond, these are the estimated amounts that we more than likely would need in order to address what we identified as the most critical of projects. This is not the end of the list. There are many other things at the port that need to be invested in, and we're looking at other means of how do we do that. We're looking at how we can schedule to make it workable, because we do have limits to how much we can pay at the end of the day. You know, the sky's not the limit in terms of let's just do everything that hasn't been addressed in the last 50 years and let's do it now. We're trying to do it in a responsible way where we can identify the most critical of projects that we need to address now, and then see what other funding sources, including grants, and also, like I said, our facility maintenance fee. What can we use of smaller projects that we can identify to do those type of repairs? We've been doing that certainly in the time I've been at the port. But with regards to PUC, the PUC, when we did our presentation, these are the things we need. These are the potential projects that we need to have addressed in the near term. This is the estimated general cost of what we believe it's going to cost to do that. Certainly the prerogative, it's always the prerogative of the legislature to decide, are you going to pass bond legislation to assist us in financing this, or you don't? But there was never any presentation on our part that we, guarantee anything. I mean, that's something that has to be done by a deliberative body. Certainly I, of all people, have some experience. So I don't want you to get that impression that that was the case. The PUC actually ordered the Port Authority of Guam to present the 5-year rate petition, primarily because they also identified that if we did not begin the process of facilitating how we were going to address funding to address these critical repairs, our continued position in terms of operations and our capability to do what we need to do is going to continue to slide south. That's the reality. And they do go in, they look at our properties, they assess where we're at. I don't think anybody likes rate increases at the end of the day, but quite frankly, I mean, this is one of the rare moments for the Port Authority in its history that the government of Guam, so to speak, is actually bellying up to the bar, should you approve this, and actually putting some tangible financial investment into the Port of Guam. The majority of the structures there, I'd guesstimate 85 to 90% of the facilities that exist at the Port of Guam were built by the U.S. federal government. The most recent significant investment, again, was made by the Department of Defense, the $50 million. The upgrades to Route 11 Another $17+ million in the last 5 years were made by the Department of Defense. The actual construction back in the late 60s of the Port Authority of Guam and all these main structures that we're talking about were paid for by the federal government. And at the end of the day, I don't know any other facility here. Is the airport? Is it Guam Waterworks? Is it Guam Power Authority, the hospital? The government of Guam in general has put very little investment into the Port of Guam, and yet I think at the end of the day we realize what a critical service the Port of Guam provides to Guam, to our people, and to the economy. So this is actually one of the first times, not only are we pursuing a bond, but actually pursuing this amount of financing so that we can address projects that have been left for whatever reason, however, whatever, over the years, that were not addressed to ensure that we have the ability to continue to serve our people. I mean, if we had falling concrete in this building, would we be comfortably sitting in here deliberating? Probably not. But my maintenance people, our stevedores, all our other employees that work out in the yard that service these vessels, this is the kind of environment that they're in because these buildings have been left to deteriorate. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, that is the bigger issue. I don't know if we're going to nickel and dime it at the end of the day. Again, it is your choice to choose to assist us in financing these critical projects so that we can do these upgrades and improvements that are needed so that we can be there to do the job that's expected of us. But if we don't, then all I can say is things are going to continue to slide and may affect our ability to operate, quite frankly.
Senator, I appreciate your passion. My line of questioning was in regards to the necessities of the port or whether there was false information
Absolutely
being
not,
presented.
Senator. We never presented to the PUC any assumption. We did present that we would approach the legislature with a request for financing authority to be able to address these general projects.
What I was trying to allude to is during the deliberations at the time when they were trying to address tariff increases, if at the time the tariff increase was based on something that didn't exist, such as a capitalized interest, then that would have been a good time to address other options, whether the tariff increase should have accounted for that not happening, option A, versus option B, because you, having been a senator, I'm sure would have the same feelings if now we're here deliberating this piece of legislation and I feel as though my hands are tied in other options because the tariff increase was already established. Everything was coming up to this point is based on this piece in the legislation that hasn't even been voted on, and that again is kind of where I'm coming from. Is were there other options before? And were they missed opportunities to look at other avenues with regards to whether or not we're going to take on capitalized interest, but now potentially it might be too late because here we are, everything's been set in motion without the deliberation.
I think it's fair to say, Senator, I mean, what Congress is going to do and when they're going to do it is not anything we can say or predict. Was that something almost 2 or 3 years ago when this whole petition process was initiated?
I was talking about the capitalized interest.
No, I am talking about that. I'm just referencing that. Again, it was the hope that should we be able to facilitate a bond through the legislature in this general amount for these key identified projects, that's what we presented to the PUC. At the end of the day, they are aware, as we are, because they do oversee the port. In order for us, I mean, it's not just a casual thing saying, hey, we want this money, can you give it to us? I mean, they actually spend a lot of time and effort, and they charge us by the minute practically to go out and do those type of assessments on our facilities and our capability, our equipment. You know, they're the ones that gave us the order. We are ordering you to present us a 5-year petition, and we had to respond to that. We did present that. The second time around, our board agreed to it. The first time this was presented to our board, they did not agree to the 5-year petition. They only authorized 1 year. And we went before the PUC with that 1-year approval from our board. They concurred only in the 1 year, and then they turned around and ordered us for a 5-year petition, because the reality is there, as we are aware, as they are aware, that if we do not address these critical infrastructure issues, the capability of the port to operate and service this community is going to be in a very critical situation.
Did they present any other options with regards to what a tariff increase would look like if they weren't going to pursue the upgrades without the capitalized interest? Or
we didn't get into those levels of details about the capitalized interest. I mean, at the end of the day, the PUC can as quickly withdraw what they've granted to us. They will continue as we move forward to monitor. We have to turn in regular reports to them. I'm sure come January, we have another set of reports we have to provide on our status, so they will continue to monitor our progress. But that, Senator, there's no assumption that the legislatures, we are hopeful, because at the end of the day, I mean, it might not be my responsibility, but I live here. I would be as concerned even if I was not at the port anymore, of wanting to ensure that we are able and have the capability of continuing to service our people. But when you have ignored these issues for as long as they've been ignored, and back in the day, the Guam Waterworks Authority used to be in the worst situation of autonomous agencies. That's not the case today, because we did take steps to readdress some of their critical issues, including providing them. I mean, their first major bond financing was $100 million.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Yes,
may,
Senator Espadon.
I understand the
You have a
argument.
point
I
of
think
information? Point of
it is a
information?
point of information.
Okay.
And bottom line, we understand the arguments necessary for the port to move forward. The issue before us today is whether to adopt the amendment to have capitalized interest of $4 million. And if we could just limit it to that, then I think that we can move through this process a lot more expeditiously.
Okay. Thank you very much, Senator
Thank you,
Espadon.
Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Esteves,
Yes,
do you have any
thank you,
follow-on
Mr.
questions? on
Chairman.
that?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the explanation. I think it was just important to clear that up, kind of how everything transpired, and to provide information just for the record and for the public, so that we have an understanding. So moving into the future, I think it's just important that we always, remember that knowing these things years prior, and I think the relationship between the autonomous agencies and the PUC and the legislature is extremely important. Again, the position I was just taking was it's difficult to put a senator in a position where they almost feel their hands are tied, because sometimes one line of legislation can make or break the entire intent. And so that's kind of what I was keying into as I'm deliberating whether or not I want to support that specific aspect of the amendment or not. And so thank you for providing the information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Any other discussion on the first item on the proposed amendment on capitalized interest? Senator Espadon, you're recognized on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask the question of relative to the tariff increase, when exactly that took effect?
The first 7% increase took effect in June of this year.
All right. And do you know what that
Senator Espadon, just so that they provide the entire proposal that was approved by PUC, can you just highlight the percentages and when they'll take effect?
The proposal for the rate increase was submitted to PUC, and it was a 7% for 2017, 7% for 2018, and 1% for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And the first 7% took effect June to December 31st. January 1st, the next 7% would take effect. And then in October, the 1% would take effect. And every October thereafter, the remaining 1% would be implemented, provided that the need for the increase in the tariff is justified. Otherwise, there would be no need to implement the subsequent 1% if the cash flow is there from revenues.
If I may then ask Mr. Duenas, that when you went before the PUC for the tariff increase, was it for the specific purpose of taking a look into the future of going to the bond market?
It was all inclusive. It was not just for going to the bond market. Our consultant, WSP, and Slater Nakamura, consultant for the port, for the PUC, they spent months discussing the use of the funds. They spent months looking at the operation of the Port Authority to make sure that the operation would be there and be available to provide the services to continue the growth of revenue. They looked at everything down at the Port Authority. They spent a lot of time on the status of the crane. They spent a lot of time on the salaries. They spent a lot of time on our equipment replacement.
So it was not just specific for the bond borrowing, it was for the whole operation
the whole thing
of the port and everything else.
With where the bond borrowing would take place. This was provided in the approval of the tariff 17-01 and the accompanying ALJ report, which is a component of their order. And this was provided to the committee way back in February.
Right. And Ms. Duenas, if I could just ask, in the 1 year, in the first year of the tariff increase at 7%, is there an amount that's associated with that percentage? In other words, what was that expected to gross, the 7% increase?
Well, the 7% increase would only apply to the container part of the operation. And it's a certain fee. 7% is broken down into a dollar amount. I don't have that figure available, but it's applied to incoming.
Is there a ballpark figure you could give us? I mean, and the only reason why I have to ask this, Mr. Chair, is because what's before us today is that $4 million cap I, and a colleague of ours who objects to this amendment basically makes the argument that the $4 million cap I is already covered by the tariff increase, and so again, I need to find out what is that amount that is that we could, even if it's a ballpark amount, is it going to be over $4 million that we'll see out of this 7% tariff increase?
Depending on what the interest rate is at date of issue.
I'm sorry? Depending on
the interest rate on the bond.
No, regardless of the interest rate on the bond. In other words, if there's 7% increase of tariffs at the port, what was that 7%?
No, we have to have a baseline to discuss cap I, and the baseline was, I believe, 5.8.
How much was the revenue?
The revenue for the first 6 months from June to December is estimated to be about a little bit over $1 million.
Okay, so is it safe to say that for the second half of the other 6 months, it would equally be about another $1 million, or would it be more?
Hopefully it would go up. We're hoping for volume to increase. But also bear in mind that the entire 7% is not just for debt service.
Okay.
It's for other operations in the port.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Speaker Cruz?
Thank you very much. Mine was going to follow up, actually on the same line. The first 7% was from June to December, and it raised a little over $1 million, correct? So the 7% for a full year could and should raise $2 million. And so with the next one, 7% going into starting up in 35 days, in the next year, you should be able to raise that next 2, which would be the 4 that you're trying to cap I at this point.
That's if you apply the entire revenue towards cap I.
But this was for you got this new tariff with the specific purpose of trying to pay for this bond. Unless, of course, you're telling the market that you're using it for operations and don't depend on it for the revenue to pay back this bond.
A portion of the tariff increase is to take care of other expenses. That's correct, Ms. Vice Speaker.
Just a point of information. I think what we established was when they increased the rate to 7%, that 7% was left at 7% because they had assumed on the cap I. It should have been higher.
Senators, if we can get clarification for Senator Brown, because just looking at the documentation that was circulated to all the stakeholders of the Port Authority, dated April of 2017, that the adjustment of the tariffs is included to address some operational requirements as well as facility upgrades. So, Senator Brown, please.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I would like to just read from the tariff petition. It's the order by the PUC that says they're authorized to implement the rate increases to the tariff, and it gives the rate 7%, 7%, 1. And then it says, they're ordered to file with the Commission actual data for FY17 concerning the following: revenue and net income, operating expenses, debt service and capital costs, any operating reserves, and throughput cargo. They're further ordered to file with the Commission actual data concerning all the sub-items listed in ordering provision number 3 above, which is what I just read. These reports shall capture data since the most recent filing. PAG is further ordered to return to the Commission for a rate investigation in the event of the following: A, the Guam CPI exceeds 4% per annum. B, cargo throughput exceeds or falls short of the current projected growth rate with more than a 5% variance. C, PAG loses its appeal of a $15 million arbitration award. And D, the cranes require replacement 2 or more years sooner than currently planned. They were further ordered to file a detailed timeline related to its plans for debt issuance by July 1, 2017, to provide PUC with semi-annual reports detailing the status of their efforts to secure such bonds, seek PUC approval prior to any annual increases to its direct labor charges, ordered to pay regulatory fees. But if I may, sorry, maybe I should read this part. It's the, it says what they came in for and what they're going to use it for. Their findings by the PUC say that the rate plan will support PAG's continued payment on debt service on existing loans of about $2.2 million per year, which include acquisition of cargo handling equipment, wharf repairs, acquisition of the Port of Los Angeles cranes, and top lifters, as well as allow PAG to implement capital projects that total $57.7 million, which include a gate operating system, replacement of PAG's administration building, hotel wharf, and water line. PAG further intends on replacing Crane 3. The ALG therefore found that the tariff increases will help PAG move forward and focus on the long-term sustainability. And then under their, sorry if I may read just, oh no, that's it, I guess. I thought there was one that says the, wait, sorry, just here. No, I guess that's it, Mr. Speaker. Oh, okay, so.
Senators, the document that the Vice Speaker is alluding to, I believe, is in the committee report. If I can ask you all to review that, and we will recess until 2 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you, Senators.